Hello learners of Diploma course in Creative Writing English. I am Kiran Misra and today I'll be telling you about narrative writing and the elements of narrative writing. Narrative is a story. It is a writing that connects ideas, concepts or events. It shows their pattern, how they are related to each other or to specific ideas, themes or concepts. Storytelling or telling a narrative is an art that requires practice, and how we shape the narrative and how we connect the events. It involves an overarching set of aims or effects, whether you do it consciously or unconsciously. For example, in a comedy narrative, the overarching aim is to surprise or shock or otherwise lead the audience or reader to be amused. Now, there are 5 types of narratives. The first is the descriptive narrative. Second is the viewpoint narrative. Third is the hierarchical narrative, which goes in chronology. Fourth is a linear narrative that moves in sequence. And then you have the non-linear narrative, which does not follow any sequence. Now, what are the 3 elements that comprise a narrative? In fact, there are more than 3, but essentially, first, when you plan to tell a narrative, you must have a plot. Plot is the sequence of events in your narrative, which will include some background information, the conflict that takes place, the climax of the story, and then the resolution, which leads to the conclusion. Many writers actually map their plot. They chalk out their stories right from the beginning till the end. And whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction, if you prepare a plot, if you map your story, this can work wonderfully as an outline. The second element of a narrative is setting. What is setting? When you read a narrative, you feel you have been transported to another place, and that is setting. And this is very, very important for a narrative. The setting of your narrative establishes the time, the place, and the environment in which the main characters or the narrator operates. Now, crafting a high-quality setting is what lends authenticity and credibility to your story. And if it is not well done, your story will fall flat. Then come the characters in your narrative or the characters in your story. They are the ones who take the story forward. They create your story. And sometimes characters can be the reason for your readers to fall in love. They are the characters that can keep you up at night because you're so fascinated by them. There have been some memorable characters in history that we all remember. And I'm talking about the history of literature. Now, who are your characters? How do they behave and interact with the narrative as a whole? Who is the protagonist of your story? Who is the antagonist of your story? How are they different from each other? You will have to invest some time in researching your character's identity, behavior, circumstances, and motivation. All this will help you to create a world that the readers and you yourself get involved with wholeheartedly. Then we come to the other important element of a narrative, and that is point of view. Who is telling the story, and why is that person telling the story? You have to establish that point of view in your story or your poem. And that is a very essential element because this will allow the reader to understand the motivation behind why the story is being told. Now, to have a consistent point of view can be a very challenging craft, and it will help you to master your narrative and provide your work with a guiding voice that the readers would love to read. Let's examine the different points of view. You have the first person narrator. who tells the story from the perspective of one or several characters with the word I or we. What are the advantages of a first-person narrator? It can captivate your audience because the narrator is someone who's actually in the action, involved in the story, and writing in first person can captivate your readers even more. The readers can actually envision the characters' actions through their own eyes. The first-person narrative comes very easy for first-time authors. The first-person point of view brings the readers close to the character. And for non-fiction, it can lend credibility to the writing because it actually happened to the writer. Then you have the third-person limited narrator who tells the story from an outside perspective, from the perspective of one of the characters, which is usually the protagonist. And the third-person limited narrator can relate events, thoughts, or actions, but it is only limited to themselves, that single character. For example, if the narration is from the point of view of the protagonist, the narrator cannot relate events that are happening across the town from where the protagonist is. Nor can they relate the interior thoughts, what is going on in the mind of other characters. Now, the third-person limited narration uses the pronouns he, she, or they. Then you have the third-person omniscient narrator. This also tells the story from an outside perspective, but this narrator is not limited to actions or thoughts of one character. He is omniscient, present everywhere. He knows all the information of the story, can relate to the events of the story, the actions and speech, as well as what is going on inside the mind of any character. There are no limits for this narrator. Now, what are the questions you should ask yourself while choosing a point of view, POV? First, does the narrator reflect an inner or outer perspective on the story? And second, why has the author selected this particular point of view? What would change if the story was told from a different point of view? So this is a very important choice you have to make at the very beginning of writing your narrative. Which is the point of view that you'll be choosing? Who is going to be telling the story? Then another important element of a narrative is theme. This should be very clear in your mind when you are writing a narrative or a story. This is a fundamental literary element. It helps you to stay focused on a narrative. And when you have a focused and clear theme, the publishers can also pitch your book or story to the right audience. They can put it in the right genre. What are the lessons that your characters are going to learn? At the end of the story, the narrative, or the poem, what is the main takeaway? This is your theme. Then we come to symbolism of the narrative. When you study literature, there's a lot of talk surrounding symbolism. This may be an overrated literary element for some people, but actually symbolism helps to layer meaning within a narrative. Let's take a few examples. In that novel, The Great Gatsby, the green light is a symbol. Harry's scar in Harry Potter is a symbol. In narratives, symbols are what readers hold on to long after the story is over. Symbolism is what the readers gravitate to. Then it is very essential for your narrative, for your story to have a conflict. What is it that motivated the character to move ahead? What is it that built up the action? How does that conflict affect the plot and ultimately dictate the theme of the narrative? What is the defining conflict in your story? What conflict inspired the poem? I think the most classic example of the conflict that we take of our epic verse Ramayana is the fact that the conflict was of Ram with Ravan, and he had to bring Sita back from Lanka. Having defined a conflict allows the reader to better understand your work, sympathize with your characters or narrator, and ultimately appreciate the complexity of the plot that you have created. Try to analyze the conflicts in all the major works that you've studied of novels and short stories, and you'll find that the successful stories have a very clear conflict in them. Now we come to the style. The element of style is the way the writer uses the language that includes diction, voice, tone, sentence, style, etc. One must pay attention to these details because the reader must identify how and why you chose a particular word or a sentence and crafted it in that style. It adds a deeper effect and meaning to the story. While choosing a style, what are the questions to consider? Is the diction hard or simple to understand? Are the sentences short or complex? Why did the writer make these stylistic choices? And how do these choices add or detract from the effect of the story? Now, I had spoken about the different types of narratives earlier. I will explain them a little better now. Let's analyze the common types of narratives. First, the linear narrative. It presents the events of the story in the order in which they actually happened. First this happened, then that happened, then next this happened. I think one of the best examples of narrative linearity can be found in the novel Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which offers different narrative perspectives but unfolds the plot in a linear and chronological manner. Then you have a non-linear narrative, which presents the events of the story out of order, and it can use flashback and other literary devices to shift the chronology of a story. For example, in Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, Odysseus's adventures are presented out of order. This has the effect of building suspense throughout the long narrative poem, and the reader is left to wonder, how did Odysseus' ordeals begin? This style is also called in medias res. This is a kind of storytelling when you begin your narrative in the heat of the action, before starting over at the beginning to explain how you actually got there from where you started. By dropping your audience right into the middle of the most exciting part of the story, right where the action is, they'll be gripped from the beginning and they'll stay engaged, they'll stay hooked on to find out what happens. But you have to be careful while employing this style. Don't give away too much of the action straight away. Try hinting at something bizarre or unexpected, something that needs more explanation. Just give your audience enough information to keep them hooked as you go back and set the scene of your story. Then, the other kind of narrative is the quest narrative, in which the protagonist works tirelessly towards a goal. The pursuit of the goal likely becomes their all-consuming passion, and they must face seemingly unsurmountable obstacles along the way. Typically, this object of their pursuit is geographically remote. Like, for example, a prince who must get to the cave to fight the dragon to win the princess. And he has to go on a long journey to obtain it, like Odysseus does in returning home to his wife in the Odyssey. The next is the viewpoint narrative. It is designed to express the points of view or subjective personal experience of the main character or other fictional characters in the story. In the viewpoint narrative writing, moods, feelings, and other sensory details are filtered through the narrator's own life and his or her subjective point of view. It takes the form of first-person narration or third-person omniscient narration, in which the omniscient narrator switches between the point of views and private thoughts of multiple central characters. The viewpoint narrative allows for the possibility of an unreliable narrator in which the person telling the story presents information subjectively and at times in an untrustworthy manner. This unreliable narrator is deliberately deceptive, maybe a noted liar or a trickster, or unintentionally misguided, like a middle schooler who may not fully understand the events taking place. forcing the reader to question their credibility as a storyteller. Like we have the case of Vladimir Nabokov's book Lolita. The first-person narrative comes from Humbert Humbert, a man who's been in a psychiatric clinic multiple times and casts the entire story in a subjective, untrustworthy light. You see, that is their viewpoint. That's the way they saw it. That may not be necessarily the truth. The other common narrative techniques is foreshadowing, when the author begins dropping hints about a situation or an event that will come later in the story, in the future. This is called foreshadowing. You have flashback, when a character is taken back in time to remember or relive an event. Then it is said that the author is using the flashback technique. And then you have the backstory, which adds depth or layers to a tale by attaching the story to an external event, either real or fictional. You have another technique called nested loops, where you layer 3 or more narratives within each other. You place your most important story, the core of your message, in the center, and use the stories around it to elaborate or explain that central theme or principle. You have another technique, monomyth, which is also called the hero's journey, which is a story structure that is found in many folk tales, myths, and religious writings from around the world. Here, the hero is called to leave their home and sets out on a difficult journey. They move from somewhere they know into a threatening, unknown place. Another technique is called the mountain technique. The mountain structure is a way of mapping the tension and drama in a story. It is similar in some ways to a monomyth because it helps us to plot when certain events occur in a story. And yet it is different because it doesn't necessarily have a happy ending. The first part of the story is given to setting the scene. Then it is followed by just a series of small challenges, and then the action rises before a climactic conclusion. It's something like those TV series. Each episode has its ups and downs, all building up to a big finale at the end of the season. Then you also have a technique called the false start. This is when you begin to tell a seemingly predictable story before unexpectedly disrupting it and beginning it over again. You lure your audiences into a false sense of security and then shock them by turning the tables. This format is great for talking about a time that the protagonist failed in something and then was forced to go back to the start and reassess. There is another technique of storytelling, and that is petal structure. It is a way of organizing multiple stories around one central concept. It is useful if you have several unconnected stories you want to tell, or things you want to reveal, that all relate back to one single message. You tell your stories one by one before returning back to the center. The petals can overlap as one story introduces the next, but each should be a complete narrative in itself. By doing so, you can weave a rich tapestry of evidence around your central theory, or strong emotional impressions around your idea. So, dear learners, I hope you found this tutorial useful for writing a narrative and understanding what are the styles and the elements that you have before you that you could use possibly to build up a very impressive, credible, and an appealing narrative which will keep your readers hooked on. Happy writing. This is your lecturer, counselor, friend, Kiran Misra.